Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. With the Scottish Parliament in recess at the moment, we decided not to do one this week, but we join you this week when there's an absolutely packed news agenda. We're going to start with the Supreme Court ruling today on the whole issue of gender identity. Then we're going to talk about the Scunthorpe Stouche, to nationalise or not to nationalise, and what consequences does that have for the Grangemouth oil refinery? And an opinion poll which is suggesting that yes has a big lead in the constitutional preference options. Well, how does that actually play? It may well be an issue in the forthcoming Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse by-election, which has been called this week for the 5th of June, so we'll pore over that as well. But let's start with the issue of today's Supreme Court ruling. Alex, just begin by going back over the narrative which led to today.
Yes, today's ruling, which has determined that for the purposes of the Equality Act, sex is a question of biological sex, not certified sex. In other words, a trans person with a gender recognition certificate should be considered to be of their biological sex, not the sex that is certified as a result of acquiring that GRC, is the culmination of a long-running legal dispute involving multiple court cases in multiple courtrooms that traces its way all the way back to 2018, in fact, when the Scottish Parliament passed a bill legislating for gender equality in terms of representation on public health, the boards of public bodies, so NHS health boards and organisations of that sort should henceforth be, gender balanced, an equal number of men and women on them. The question that arose, though, and this was something that the campaign group, the feminist campaign group for Women Scotland, wanted to clarify in law, was what is the Scottish Government's definition of a woman? Is that meaning restricted to biological sex, i.e., people born female? Or could somebody, a born male, but who had gone through the process of acquiring a gender recognition certificate to change their gender, change their legal sex, could they be considered a woman under the terms of, or for the purposes of, the Representation on Public Boards bill? The courts in general in Scotland, the Court of Session, sided with the Scottish Government on this. But For Women Scotland then appealed this to the Supreme Court in London, were granted leave to appeal, and they were joined in making representations on the case by lesbian organisations, Scottish Lesbians, the Lesbian Project, by the LGB Alliance, and so on, because the impact and the implications for this case, although it was rooted in statutory interpretation, which is a dry and viscous area of the law, nevertheless have profound implications for public bodies and organisations of all sorts, actually, across the United Kingdom, not just in Scotland, in terms of what is the definition of sex and can people change sex. The Scottish Government argued that yes, people can change sex. We no longer believe sex is immutable, was something that the Scottish Government argued in court. Well, Lord Reid and Lord Hodge and the other Supreme Court justices have decided unanimously today that sex, in terms of the application of the Equality Act, does mean biological sex. This does not mean that trans people lose any rights. Lord Hodge, delivering the verdict, was very keen to say, for they retain protections under the Equality Act in terms of gender reassignment, but they are not to be considered biological women in the same way as, natal women are. So the mantra that trans women are women has fallen if the meaning of woman is to be determined as biological woman. They cannot be women in the same way as natal women are.
Okay, we're going to have a look at what the implications are for the Scottish Government in terms of the advice that goes to public bodies, and how this will impact upon certain policies. But I'm grateful to the BBC for a relatively coherent and cogent analysis of the judgment. Let me just again run through it, because this is a story which came out earlier on this morning. People will be perhaps listening to this news for the first time. So what has the court actually said? It said that a person with a gender recognition certificate in the female gender does not come within the definition of a woman under the Equality Act 2010 and the statutory guidance issued by Scottish ministers is incorrect. Secondly, gender reassignment and sex are separate bases for discrimination and inequality. Thirdly, the definition of sex under the Equality Act makes clear that the concept of sex is binary. A person is either a man or a woman. Fourthly, interpreting sex as certificated sex would cut across the definitions of man and woman, and thus the protected characteristic of sex in an incoherent way. The biological interpretation, in terms of the Equality Act, which we conclude, say the justices, is the only correct one, does not cause disadvantage to trans people with or without a gender recognition certificate. And finally, nothing in the ruling, and here is a direct quote, is intended to discourage the appointment of trans people to public boards or to minimize the importance of addressing their underrepresentation on such boards. But of course, ministers are now going to have to issue new guidelines on this. And the new guidelines, essentially, Alex, are going to stand the existing ones on their head.
Absolutely, because the importance of a judgment of this sort isn't just that henceforth guidelines will have to be different. It is that in the past, or the current application of guidelines is frequently unlawful. That is to say that in the NHS, in prisons, in sport, in a whole range of areas and so on, the exclusion of trans people, whether they have a gender recognition certificate or not, is perfectly reasonable in terms of protecting single-sex spaces. And most of the time, for obvious reasons, these are single-sex spaces for women. And that means that, for instance, the Scottish Prison Service, which has effectively de facto operated under a policy of self-ID for many years now, most notoriously perhaps in the case of Isla Bryson, but in plenty of other instances too. Isla Bryson being the double rapist formerly known as Adam Graham, who was initially to be incarcerated in a women's prison before public furore caused a rapid reverse ferret of that policy decision. All of these policies are going to have to be rethought, and so this is a striking victory, it has to be said, I think, for Women Scotland in particular and other campaign groups. It is a vindication for a small number of parliamentarians at Holyrood and Westminster. One thinks of people like Joanna Cherry and Joan McAlpine, but neither of whom are still politicians, but still they were amongst the earliest people to raise concerns here. People like Jenny Mara and Carol Mochan from Labour, Rachel Hamilton, Ash Regan from Alba, but really a relatively small number of politicians who were on this from an early date. Well, all of those people have been vindicated, and so too have the considerable phalanx, if you like, of extra parliamentary organisations and campaign groups who have been saying, look, we need to talk about these things. This is not a question of us being bigots or anything like that. That there is a debate to be had here. And time again, from the very topmost levels of the Scottish Government and so on, they were told, no, there is no debate here. There are no legitimate concerns. Any concerns about the propriety and safety and security of women's single-sex spaces are motivated by bigotry. And that was the clear implication of many things that Nicola Sturgeon said. It was the clear implication of many of the things that people like Patrick Harvey said. And a majority of MSPs in the Parliament went along with this, and they voted for the Scottish Government's gender recognition reforms, which are a slightly different question, but nevertheless closely related to the areas under discussion today and at the Supreme Court. And all of those people, I think, should be required to justify their previous positions and asked if they still hold them.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some times when Parliament is not on the same page as the voting public. I mean, there are some issues, for example, I'm thinking of assisted dying, where sometimes public opinion is on one side of the argument and Parliament is extremely jittery about legislating in a way that the public actually wants. We had a situation here, certainly in terms of gender recognition, where there was a pretty clear view of the Scottish Parliament, and I would suggest that was at odds with the majority of public opinion in Scotland, and the justices have come down pretty resolutely one way. So it raises the question, given that much of the discussion and debate around this has been defined in terms of culture wars. Do you believe, Alex, that those wars effectively are at an end? Or for the purposes of the debate in Parliament, given that I think MSPs will accept this ruling, or the overwhelming majority will accept this ruling, does this put this really rather angry debate to bed?
Well, I think there are lots of ways of getting at that, aren't there? I mean, put it this way. I would be surprised if a government led by John Swinney and Kate Forbes wanted to revisit this, even though I think you could make a plausible argument that in the light of this ruling, that the acquisition of a gender recognition certificate does not, in effect, bring with it any material benefits to a trans person beyond the administrative advantages of having their birth certificates and death certificates and passports and etc. all in line with their preferred identity. I think you could make an argument that the Scottish Government could revisit its gender recognition reforms because the basis upon which Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, justified his intervention into that debate and the use of a Section 35 veto, the basis upon which that decision was taken has largely been superseded by today's Supreme Court ruling. So the Scottish Government could get back into this if it wanted to. But as I say, I am very doubtful that John Swinney and Kate Forbes in particular have any desire to do so. But of course, I may well be contradicted by events on this, but is that your view too, or am I missing something here?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a view within the SNP that this has been damaging. I think that they will use this judgment to draw a line under it. And I think you're absolutely right. John Swinney's view is that we have to move on. And of course, on another issue this week, the First Minister decided that he was going to move on from a previous position, and that was in relation to the Grangemouth oil refinery. Of course, the background to this is that there was emergency legislation which was passed by the House of Commons last Saturday. Parliament was recalled in order that the government could take a role in the management of the Scunthorpe steelworks. Now, some of the reporting around this, I think, has been a little bit lazy and a little bit inaccurate.
Oh, surely not, Bernard. Surely not.
It's been reported. It's been reported as a nationalisation. Well, it is not a nationalisation in the conventional sense that was understood when previous governments would nationalise aircraft or shipbuilding, as the Wilson governments did in the 1970s. This was a strategic foothold that the government decided to take in order that the furnaces could remain open, in order that there was steelmaking capacity still left within the UK. The suspicion may well have been that the Chinese management of that plant were running it down to the extent that the plant would eventually have to be mothballed, and people would have to look to China for the importing of cheap steel. The government have acted here. They've acted resolutely. Whether or not, and I think this is a perfectly legitimate question, given the closeness of the Labour government to the trade unions at the plant is concerned, why it took them so late in the day and why ministers are still not in a position to be say that we can 100% guarantee that new coke deliveries to Scunthorpe will ensure longer term that there will be a manufacturing steel facility there. That being said, the consequence of the government going down a part nationalisation route was that in the House of Commons, Stephen Flynn stood up in the debate on Saturday and said, well, if the government are prepared to nationalise Scunthorpe, then they should be prepared to nationalise Grangemouth. Now, that view is a point of view that he expressed. There's only a particular problem with it, and it's this. At no point in the debate about the future of the Grangemouth oil refinery has the First Minister ever called for the nationalisation of the plant. Indeed, the trade union Unite the Union have never called unambiguously for a wholesale nationalisation of the plant. They've been concerned about jobs and a future for the refinery. The issue of whether or not it should be taken into public ownership was not one which they've greatly raised at all. And at Butte House on Monday, we then had the First Minister, I have to tell you, much to the surprise of Unite the Union, much to the surprise of Unite the Union, then comes out with the line, well, in certain circumstances, if Scunthorpe is fully nationalised, so should Grangemouth. This was a beyond 11th hour intervention, and I suspect that John Swinney had to commit to that, given what Mr. Flynn had said in the House of Commons, but it is my understanding in private meetings with the trade union that John Swinney was perfectly clear that the issue of nationalisation was never on the agenda because the cost to the public purse of such a policy would be prohibitive. So it begs the question, was the First Minister bounced by Mr. Flynn? And the other thing that I think that it raises is that, and John Swinney said this in our podcast that we recorded at Butte House some weeks ago, that the behind-the-scenes relationship between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government is actually pretty warm and cordial. Well, his Butte House statement on Monday is one way to make that relationship a little bit less cordial.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're right to raise the possibility that the First Minister was somehow sort of bounced into this by Stephen Flynn, by other SNP politicians who have been sort of using Grangemouth as a sort of thing. Look, the UK government will intervene in Scunthorpe to save British steel and so on, but it won't intervene in Grangemouth. Therefore, this is just another demonstration that when push comes to shove, all Westminster governments, regardless of party, are the same. They are instinctively anti-Scottish, which is a sort of statement that plays well with some of the SNP's core constituency. Obviously, I think it strikes a lot of other people, and I confess to being one of these people myself, as being unbearably tedious and juvenile. Because if the claim that not nationalising Grangemouth is anti-Scottish is true, then is it anti-Welsh not to nationalise a refinery at Milford Haven, or is it anti-English not to nationalise a refinery in England? I mean, this seems pretty obvious. And so, the refinery at Grangemouth is very old. It would require an enormous amount of investment to get it up to modern standards at a time when the products that it specializes in, which is the refining of petrol and diesel for automobiles, is in long-term decline in terms of, as we moved away from vehicles powered by the internal combustion engine and into our new all-electric age. That again suggests that Grangemouth would have, as a refinery, a limited future. And of course, the refinery is only a part of the wider Grangemouth complex, which is much of it to do with chemicals and other things. The issues around all of this. You could see the political upside for the First Minister in saying this to some degree, but I think he does look foolish in as much as he's also making a demand that cannot and will not actually be met. The wider question, I suppose, is one of industrial strategy at both the UK and Scottish level, and questions that arise over energy policy as well, because of course a blast furnace has to run 24/7, and it is an immensely heavy user of power. And one of the reasons why British Steel struggles to be competitive, and there are lots of reasons for it, but one of them is because of the extremely high wholesale price of electricity in this country. And that is why we've seen a long-term decline in the chemicals industry in the UK too. I mean, Teesside, for instance, used to be an absolute behemoth for the chemicals industry no longer is. And that's a problem that stretches back years. It's not, as the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph have been saying this week, just because Ed Miliband is a sort of green eco warrior and zealot. It is because, over a prolonged period of time, we have put in place a system whereby electricity is extremely expensive in the United Kingdom for a number of different reasons. Although it is true that people like Ed Miliband, when the Conservative government was taking the policies that were doing all of this, that contributing to all of this, was also sort of demanding, well, why aren't you going further and harder and faster on all of these policies? But fundamentally, the underlying problems at British Steel and indeed at Grangemouth are a responsibility for all political parties, not for just the current government, although it's the current government obviously that has to sort it out.
I watched the whole of the Butte House exchanges on this, and Mr. Swinney was very, very careful with his language. I mean, he was almost sort of qualifying it. Again, I think that just as the reporting of the government's position vis-a-vis Scunthorpe, I think that what he said at that briefing was slightly over-reported by. I mean, he was not saying nationalise and nationalise now. That's not what he was saying. He was said in the circumstances where full nationalisation of Scunthorpe was the UK government's position, then that should be the issue in relation to Grangemouth. Now, my starting point in all of this is quite simple. The owners of capital, capitalists, will maintain operations where there is money to be made, where there is a return for shareholders to be made, where there is profit to be made. When there is no profit to be made, and when there is a hemorrhaging of money to the point that it becomes heavy and loss-making, capitalists will get out, because that is the nature of the beast. And therefore, if they're getting out of an industry or a plant with a strategic interest in an economy, which is important to the infrastructure of an economy, any government which is going to ask itself questions has to be able to satisfy that if it intervenes for a pressing economic concern, it has to ask itself the question, can we intervene? Can we take a stake if we're having to pony up hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money? Can we find a market for these products, a market for the products where we can make money on it? And if we take a strategic stake, the taxpayer can get the stake back should they sell it off at some future date back into the private sector. I do not believe that there is any political party who would be the government at Westminster, or indeed any political party who would be the government of an independent Scotland, would nationalise a plant or an industry on the basis that the taxpayer would simply pick up the loss-making bill year after year after year, decade after decade after decade. In the case of Scunthorpe, if you're to go with a full nationalisation, assuming that you could, because I think that there would, this might get tied up in the courts and it might get all very, very messy. But if you are losing hundreds of millions of pounds a year, in the course of a decade, you're talking a loss which runs to billions. And no government, either a Westminster government or a government of an independent Scotland, is going to fully nationalise if the consequence is that the taxpayer is being asked to write a blank cheque.
Well,
If, on the other hand, there is a market for goods, that's a different thing altogether.
Well, you say that, Bernard, but even within our own wee patch of the world here in Scotland and so on, we have the example of the Scottish Government nationalising a loss-making shipyard that has gone bust twice this century and maintaining ownership of that shipyard at a cost to the public purse at the moment of almost £1 million a week, and with no end of that in sight. I speak, of course, of Ferguson's in Port Glasgow and the ferry fiasco.
Prestwick Airport?
Prestwick Airport has been nationalised. I think it now breaks even on a more, sort of one accountancy measure and so on. But there is, every so often there's a rumor that somebody is interested in buying it, but nobody ever actually does buy it or take it off the government's hands. The question of British Steel and so on, and of course the steel industry has been, well, the Attlee government nationalised the steel industry. The Conservatives then privatised it in the 1950s. The Wilson government then nationalised it again in the 1960s, and it was privatised in the 1980s by the Conservative government. And here we go again. There are arguments. There is, I suppose, a respectable argument that steel and blast furnace steel, rather than electric arc furnace steel, which makes use of scrap metal for making new steel, there is an argument that steel is a kind of core strategic asset, and that the British steelworks at Scunthorpe are in some ways a heavy industry version of the banks, in as much as it's too big to fail, not just in terms of the local economy there, but more generally for the UK's longer term economic and security interest. Because, of course, the main justification offered in the House of Commons, it seemed to me, for the government's intervention with British Steel in Scunthorpe wasn't so much the economics or even the jobs being protected. It was the suggestion that the ability to manufacture virgin steel was a core national security issue, particularly at this time. Now, that may well be the case, and I certainly don't doubt the sincerity of that belief. It's not clear to me that that is actually true, unless we think that there are circumstances in which it is plausible to believe that we would be unable to import steel as we presently do from Germany or Belgium or Italy or France. I don't myself see those situations arising, so I'm not entirely convinced by the security aspect of this argument, save to the extent that I think it is a kind of psychological security. And here again, we get back to the, it's similar to some of the impulses, I think, which led the Scottish Government to nationalise Ferguson's shipyard, which is the thing that this is the last, one of the few remaining totems of our former industrial might. And we cannot psychologically be seen to let that go, even if economically, in the current situation, so on, there is no pressing logic for those plants or those yards to remain open.
Yeah, and just as I don't think that John Swinney will want to pursue previous positions on gender recognition, I would actually be very surprised if John Swinney pursues with any degree of gusto the nationalisation line, partly because I don't think that the intention of the UK Labour government is to go down that path at all. But I was appearing on television the other night, and there was a Labour and an SNP MSP on kicking lumps out of one another on the issue of nationalise or not to nationalise. So it may well be, and I don't expect that the First Minister will pursue it, it may well be that it still will be an issue that might even kick around in the next big test of electoral opinion on the 5th of June, which is the Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse by-election.
Is that a very professional link into our third item there, Bernard? A beautiful segue.
Done this before.
Yes, well, I mean, it's wonderful to see how you've come on mightily in the time that we've been doing this podcast in that regard.
Absolutely. Of course, just to say and to remind our listeners and viewers that this by-election is a result of the death of Christina McKelvey, MSP. I didn't have a lot of dealings with Christina when I was political editor at STV, but I did have some. She was a very bubbly personality, a very, very warm individual. And I think it's only right to say that the tributes which were made in the chamber following her death were among the warmest, if not the warmest, in the entire devolved era. But the business of democracy goes on. The voters in that constituency will go to the polls on the 5th of June. I'm going to get Alex's take in just a minute on how he thinks this may well go. But again, just to give some sort of parameters about what we're talking about here, the 2021 result in Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse, the SNP won 46.2% of the vote. Labour were on 33.6%. The Conservatives on quite a chunky 17.5%. I think we'll both agree where that's going. And the Liberal
and the postcodes that it came from.
and the Liberal Democrats, as they did in most Central Belt constituencies, lost their deposit last time around on 2.8%. The turnout was 61%, and on those figures, the Labour Party would need a swing of just over 6% in order to take the seat from the SNP. We'll go into some of the other psephology that happened in South Lanarkshire seats at the general election, but those are the figures: 46, 33, 17.5, 2.8. Given where the current Scottish polls are, Alex, is your hunch that if those polls are correct, it's an SNP hold with a lower share of the vote, and the only question, how big a fall in the Labour and Tory votes to Reform UK?
I think that's broadly it. I would expect there to be the SNP to hold the seat and to hold it quite comfortably, because I do not believe at the current moment voters in a by-election of this sort, and I would also expect turnout to be pretty low. It might well be below 40%, and that always queers the pitch a little bit when it comes to these by-elections. But I would expect that if you have a disgruntled electorate, and I think it is fair to say that we do, then they have a choice of targets at this by-election in terms of who do they want to register their disgruntlement against, if you like. Is it the Scottish Government, the SNP that's been in power for 17 years, 18 years now, or is it the Labour government at a UK level? And I think in this by-election, it strikes me as being probable that, just given the current temper and tone of politics, that a greater number of voters will wish to express their dissatisfaction with Labour in that constituency than with the SNP. And consequently, as a result of that, even before one considers anything else, I would expect it to be a relatively comfortable Labour hold, SNP hold. The question, as you rightly say, is do Labour come second? Or do Reform supplant Labour and come second? I think that is quite possible in that constituency. I think it is almost certain that Reform will beat the Conservative Party into, at the very least, third place. And that has all kinds of implications, obviously, for what might happen in comparable constituencies at next year's Holyrood election.
Yeah. Of course, there isn't contiguity between parliamentary boundaries for Holyrood and for the Westminster Parliament. So it's difficult to make direct comparisons because the boundaries are different. But Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse is within South Lanarkshire. And if we look at the South Lanarkshire UK parliamentary constituencies, and of course this is the most recent test of national political opinion, we've got Hamilton and Clyde Valley constituency, East Kilbride and Straven, and Rutherglen, although again, before we get sticklers sending us text messages, part of the Rutherglen constituency also nudges into North Lanarkshire. But these were new constituencies, of course, upon which the last general election was fought. And therefore, when we were talking about swings in these South Lanarkshire constituencies, they were notional swings. But let's just put this in perspective about how much things have changed. These constituencies were all held notionally by the SNP. They were all picked up by the Labour Party. In Hamilton and Clyde Valley, the swing to Labour at the general election last year, 19%. In East Kilbride and Straven, the swing 22%. In Rutherglen, the swing 16%. These are swings that you normally associate with parliamentary by-elections, not in general election situations. And as I said right at the beginning of this discussion, Labour only need a swing of just over 6% to take Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse. So if they are anywhere in the ballpark that they were at the general election, not only should they win this, they should win it at an absolute canter. But what this by-election, I suspect, is going to demonstrate is that the voters, it's horses for courses. And of course, in by-elections, what tends to happen is that voters are not electing a government. They absolutely understand that they're not electing a government. They have an opportunity to let off steam. And I think that we can say that that 17.5% for the Conservatives is going to look very, very much reduced. In fact, I raise it here. I hope I don't have egg on my face. On an election night, I suspect I'll be sitting in some studio on election night. I think with the Tories, you could be into lost deposit territory all the way down to 5%. I am less certain about how far the Labour vote will fall, but it is not inconceivable, I put it no higher than that Reform could come second.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think Anna Sawa was not going to thank you for setting the expectations bar for Labour at, well, Labour should win this at a canter, shouldn't they? The Labour are certainly going to, I think, be downplaying their chances here, even though, of course, if Labour are to have a serious shot at forming an administration at Holyrood next year, this is the sort of constituency they would need to pick up from the SNP. So to that extent, I think we will get a clearer picture of exactly how likely any such alternative ministry is. I think at the moment quite unlikely, because we look at the opinion polls and we see, the reality of Scottish politics right now is that, post the general election, the headline figure has been, that Labour's support has collapsed. It's gone from, in the low 30s to at best the low 20s, and in some opinion polls even lower than that. And so what you have is a fragmentation of, if you like, the anti-SNP vote. Whereby you have, Labour, Conservatives, Reform, Liberal Democrats, all taking votes from each other, essentially, and not from the SNP. And that leaves the SNP in this sort of curious position whereby it could well, on current polling figures, regardless of pollster, actually, win a thumping victory next year on around 30 to 35% of the vote. It could get 60 seats, maybe even more, who knows? But it will do so on a much, much lower share of the vote than it has on previous occasions when the SNP has won 60 or more seats. And I think that has considerable implications for, if you like, refereeing the outcome of any poll. And we are, of course, a long, long way away from it all. More than a year, a lot could change, etc., etc., etc. So this is all highly speculative. But nevertheless, I would suggest to you that in such an event, that an SNP with a massive parliamentary victory on a low share of the vote is not an SNP with, if you like, the moral or political authority to reopen questions of constitutional organisation, the Scotland's future, constitutional future, because if you've only got the support of 1 in 3 voters, that is very, very different starting place from if you have the support of 1 in 2.
Of course. I mean, yeah, absolutely. But in those circumstances, I think it would depend on within the Parliament what percentage share are the Greens getting, what percentage share are Alapa getting. The question for John Swinney, and he confirmed this in the podcast that we did with him at Butte House, that manifesto is going to have to say something on independence. Now, the issue, I think, will be is that if they continue to look good, and if they win and win comfortably in Hamilton, LARKHALL and Stonehouse, there will be people within the party who will be emboldened to say, you have to push the boat out on independence in 2026. And there will be others within the party who will say, don't be so stupid. Starmer's doing a great job of keeping us in power. Let's not flag up a constitutional issue which will derail the election campaign. But on the specifics of this constituency, I mean, if the SNP win with anything around their share of the vote in 2021, I mean, it would have to be regarded as quite a remarkable result, given how long they've been in power, because this is the kind of seat, as you rightly say, that if Labour have any chance of being the largest party in 2026, they have to take, and they have to take pretty comfortably. And a situation where the SNP are there or thereabouts on the 21 vote share, with Labour and the Tories well down, would be really, really bad. Labour will simply say, it's an aberration.
Mm-hmm.
It will be remembered as the Reform UK by-election. By-elections are not a portent of what happens in a general election when you're electing a government. And all of that is true. All of that is true. But here's the problem for Labour. Momentum and credibility in politics is important. And if they get a disastrous result in this by-election, it will feed into a narrative that Starmer is administering the last rites to Sarwar's ambitions to be First Minister.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think an SNP victory in this by-election will, in one sense, only tell us that the SNP are the tallest pygmies in the tribe. It doesn't, I think, impart any great blessing or endorsement of the Scottish Government's record. Again, if we look at other polling and so on, we find that voters are pretty dissatisfied with its record. That doesn't mean they like any alternative any better. That all our political parties, all our political leaders actually are pretty unpopular at the moment. There isn't an inspirational figure in Scottish politics who commands a kind of sort of cross-party respect at present. The country isn't in a particularly happy place. And that is true of the UK as a whole as well, of course. But whereas Keir Starmer has, another 4 years or so before he has to meet the judgment of the electorate and so on. Anna Sarwar doesn't have anything like that length of time. And so, you have at the moment, the Nationalists are very buoyed by a Find Out Now poll published by the National this week, which suggested that not only would the SNP have a crushing electoral victory next May, albeit on a pretty low share of the vote, but that on the yes/no question of independence, yes has a 10-point lead according to this poll. Now, I have to say I'm fairly dubious about this. Find Out Now, they may be right, but I think they have a house effect amongst pollsters where they tend to find better numbers for yes and better numbers for the SNP than other pollsters do, just as YouGov, for instance, tends to have a house effect that operates the other direction. It tends to find larger majorities for no than for yes on the national question. It's not to say that Find Out Now are wrong necessarily, but they are, I think, on this question at this moment, an outlier.
Well, I think that you're correct in the view that the next Scottish election, it may well be people going into the polling stations, not really having much enthusiasm for anyone, but deciding what is the least worst option. And I'm reminded of a ballot paper which went for adjudication to a returning officer at an election some years ago, where the elector had scored on the ballot paper, "They're all shite, but he's a bit less shite." And I think it was George Robertson who claimed the vote.
Yeah, one of his proudest political achievements, I suspect. A badge that Lord Robertson of Port Ellen would be proud to sport in the House of Lords. Well, that seems like a very Scottish and a very appropriate note on which to conclude this episode. As always, we're very grateful to all our listeners and viewers on the YouTube channel. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter or Blue Sky. We're Ponsonby Massey at both of those things. Also, ponsonbymassey@gmail.com if you would like to email us your thoughts and so on. But thank you very much for being with us. We will be back again soon next week as Parliament returns and we contemplate what's left of this parliamentary session and everything else that will be going on. But for the time being, it is thank you very much and goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.